So today we're going to make Aemond's eye patch from House of the Dragon. The second I saw this, I knew I was going to make it because, just look at him. It's so great. He actually wears two different eye patches. You can see him wearing this one, which has sort of stitched sides, but we're going to make the one that he wears most of the time, which is the one with these rivets on the front. The shape of this eye patch is almost exactly the same as the one that Jeff Bridges wears in True Grit. You could easily modify the pattern for that one. I've made this pattern as a left eye patch because that's the eye that Aemond wears it on. If you would prefer to have it on the other eye, you could easily just reverse the whole pattern. The design of this eye patch is so weird. I'm pretty sure this is one of those things that the costume designer drew and then the leather worker just had to make it work somehow, because we've got what I'm pretty sure is just the bottom half of some rivets, which is the most sus way of attaching anything ever. We're going to use glue as well because that's just not secure. We've got a rivet that is serving no function, which I'm not judging. Sometimes you got to do things just for the aesthetic. These rivets are so close together that they're actually affecting the structural integrity of the whole thing. I did modify the pattern after making this so that it's a little bit better for you guys, but yeah, they're way too close together. The pattern is available below in US letter and A4 paper sizes. Just make sure to check the correct orientation and make sure that you've printed out at full size. On my printer, this is actual size. Sometimes it says 100%. I always include a test square on my pattern so you can measure it and make sure that it printed out correctly. I printed this out on cardstock. It's totally not necessary. It's just a bit easier to trace around thicker paper. Now I'm just cutting out the pattern. I'm using an exacto knife and a metal ruler. You could use scissors, it really doesn't matter. For the one piece, you're going to tape the two halves together. As always, I've included a legend which tells you what the symbols mean. We're just going to punch the holes in the pattern to make it a bit easier to trace them. It's really important to make sure that they're located in the correct spot, or nothing will line up when you go to attach it later. You'll notice that the holes on this section look like they don't line up on the paper version. That's because the eye patch is going to be shaped. Once you have that curve in it, the holes will line up. So I've just grabbed some leather here. This is veg tan cowhide in about a 5-ounce thickness. You want to make sure that you get veg tan, as it's the only kind of leather that allows for wet molding and shaping. I'm just tracing the pattern onto the leather. I like to use a pencil for this just because if you're using a pen and it slips, you can really stain this top surface. If you have a strap cutter, you can absolutely use that. I'm just using a metal ruler and an exacto knife. You want to cut in long, sweeping strokes and make sure not to tilt your knife from side to side so that you get a nice clean edge. I'm also tracing the holes onto the leather. You want to make sure to trace the entire hole and not just put a dot, again, because you want to make sure that the placement is exact. So we're going to punch holes in the leather. You can use either this kind of a hole punch, which is a hand grip type, or you can use the kind that you hammer with a mallet. If you're using that one, you do need a soft surface so that you don't damage your tool when you hammer it. As I was saying before, these holes are so close together. It's actually making the structure of the whole thing weaker rather than stronger, which is super dumb. I did modify it a tiny bit just so it's a little bit better for you guys, but we are going to stick with making it the way that the original was because I am, as always, a slave to accuracy, and I always feel like I have to make things as accurate as possible no matter how dumb it is. For the buckle slot, I just punch a hole at either end and then cut in between them using my knife. There's a tool that you can get that's specifically for buckle slots, but I don't do enough of them to bother. It's pretty easy to just cut these by hand. My camera very helpfully stopped recording for a couple minutes, so we're missing some footage. But what I did was rough up the areas where we're going to be gluing. It's better to just rough it up so that the glue has a bit more tooth to grab onto. Again, there's a specific tool for that, but I just use an exacto knife and an awl and just kind of scrape it up a bit so it's nice and rough. I'm going to be using barge cement. In my experience, nothing works as well as barge, but for something like an eye patch, it honestly doesn't matter. It's not like we're making a saddle. It doesn't need to be durable. So any glue really would work. Barge is super toxic, so if you are going to use it, make sure to wear a respirator and do it in a well-ventilated area, or preferably outside. Just because this is so tiny, I'm just going to use a paintbrush to apply it. Be careful not to get it on the surface because it will prevent the dye from soaking in those areas. The way that contact cement works is you apply it to both sides, let it sit for a specified amount of time, and then press the two halves together. As soon as you press it together, it done be stuck good, so you better make sure that you place it in the correct spot. For this part, it's going to be a curved surface, and as I mentioned, the holes won't line up when it's flat, so I'm just trying to bend the curve, starting with one hole and working my way down so that it all lines up. The reason I'm doing the gluing and riveting before shaping is just that it's easier to rivet on a flat surface, but you absolutely could shape it and do the gluing and riveting afterwards. Make sure to squeeze the parts together really tight. Now we're adding the rivets. I punched the holes smaller than I normally would for rivets just because we're only putting the back half on and I didn't want them to fall out. So I'm just using an awl to stretch the holes a little bit so that I can get the rivets in there. So you want it to just barely be poking out the other side. Normally I would add a top cap to these rivets, but we are what? Slaves to accuracy, so we're doing what they did in the show. I'm just using the back side of my rivet setter because that side's flat. And I'm just going to put it over the rivet the way I normally would and give it a couple taps to flatten out that little bit of metal that's poking up through the leather. This is not a structural way to use rivets, but we're doing it for the aesthetic. And we attached it with glue anyway, so it's okay. But I hate how close these four rivets are to each other. It's ridiculous. It's weakening the leather. Now I'm going to attach the buckle. The buckle that I'm using is 1 centimeter wide or 3/8 of an inch. There is a right and a wrong way, so just make sure that the pointy bit is oriented correctly. And then we're just going to secure that with a normal rivet with 2 halves on it. I'm derping out really hard. Can you guys see what I'm messing up? Yep, forgot to put the strap keeper on before riveting. Okay, so because I derped out, I decided not to use a strap keeper at all. The end is super short and it's not really necessary, but if you want to add it, here's what I would do. Cut the strip from the pattern and then trim it down to size, punch a hole at either end, and then just stitch it together, slide it over the end, and then rivet the buckle on. And it's going to look like this. It's not super necessary because the end is so short, but if you want to be accurate to the original, there you go. Normally I would attach buckles and do my riveting after I dyed everything, but I just decided to do all the rivets at once. So now we're going to shape our eye patch. Fill your sink with hot water and soak the leather until it's wet all the way through. You want to leave it underwater until bubbles stop rising, and that way you know it's completely saturated. Now when you pull leather right out of the water, it's going to be super floppy and it's not going to hold its shape well, but as it dries it will hold its shape better. You can start doing some shaping, and then you either want to let it sit for quite a while so that it dries down partially, or you can use a hairdryer to speed the process along. Preferably use your cold setting. If your hairdryer doesn't have a cold setting, then hold it further away. Now I'm just going to use my thumbs to form it into shape, pressing everything so that it's a dome. When you think you're done, I highly recommend going to a mirror and holding it up in front of your eye, and then you can adjust the shape a bit so that it's nice and comfortable and everything fits to your face really well. We don't have to do any shaping with the strap. I'm just making sure that everything's nice and smooth. Once you're happy with the shape, set it up in a supported position to dry. You don't need to use a foam head. I just have one for masks and I decided to use it. I usually leave mine overnight. Now my eye patch is completely dry and you'll see that it's stiffened up quite a bit. I don't want my straps to be stiff, so I'm just working them a little bit to soften them up. So now let's dye it. I'm using Phoebe's dark brown and a wool dauber, and we're going to dye the whole thing. So we're going to dye, as I said, normally I'd attach the buckle after dyeing, so this is actually a little bit trickier. Just making sure to get the sides, and you can also dye the back if you wish, but it's not necessary because you're not going to see it. Then I just let it sit until the dye was totally dry. Now I'm just going back in with some finish. My weapon of choice for finish is acrylic resin. I like to water mine down because I find it's too thick, and I apply 2 to 3 coats to seal everything in. I'll let the first coat dry and come back in with the second coat. And that's it, guys. We're all done. I may have lost an eye, but I gained a dragon and a badass eye patch.